Okay.
Joining me to discuss this interesting topic, Lynn
Guiney.
Well, yes. Lynn Guiney, the Chief Commercial Officer of Macquarie AirFinance, and Patrick Healy, the Group Chair to Cathay Pacific. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Good morning.
Thank you. Every time sit down to discuss something to do with SAF or climate change in the aviation industry, and particularly what we're going to talk about now is the financing of it, I very quickly get lost. Because the complexity of this issue, as we heard in the previous panel, and not just the complexity, but the ways in which we have managed to lose our way in all of this is quite extraordinary. So first of all, just start with you, Lynn.
Okay.
How big do we now believe the financing of this is going to be? Do we have a number that you're comfortable?
Well, the simple answer is no. What's the number? I think the previous panel was quite interesting. We don't have a number. We don't know exactly the cost. Even IATA's predictions are probably the best numbers that you can use. I'm in the business of owning aircraft and investing in aircraft. We're an aircraft lessor, so I'm not a financier. I'm owned by 50% by Macquarie Bank. I'm owned 25% by PGGM, the Dutch healthcare pension fund, and 25% by Australian Retirement Trust. And what I can tell you about is the kind of investments that they are doing in the industry. But in terms of my knowledge, I'm responsible for the balance sheet of Macquarie AirFinance, which is investing in aircraft assets.
The reason I put it like this is because, as we're going to discover over the next half hour, everybody plays a role in this. And yet, it's only when you step back that you suddenly see this frightening number of 4.7 trillion or whatever it might be. But you are the various, if you will, participants, aren't you, Patrick, that are going to have to deal with it. I mean, we talk about 4.7 trillion, but you're going to have to find it, not personally or in one airline.
Yeah. Well, just to come back to the original question that you asked Lynn there, Richard. I mean, we don't have a specific number, as Lynn said, but we do have a range. You know, I mean, the IATA 2024 roadmap, net zero roadmap, sets out a range. And basically, what that tells us is that in order to meet the requirements of the aviation industry by 2050, there would need to be somewhere between 3,400 and 6,700 new refineries constructed, so new facilities constructed. Now, of course, they're not just going to be producing SAF for the aviation industry. This is essentially biofuel. Some of that will go to bunker fuel. It might go to those elements of road transportation which are not able to be electrified or replaced with hydrogen cells or other solutions. And so that range, you know, the range of capital required to fund that number of new facilities is going to be somewhere between, $4.5 trillion and $8 trillion, right? So, I mean, I think the word that Marie uses in that roadmap report is eye-watering, right? These are enormous sums of money.
It's a question of how it's raised.
But just one more point before getting to that, Richard, is, you know, we have to take a step back and realize that what we're talking about here is one element of the overall energy transition, right? And, you know, as the previous panel said, there's a level of skepticism and perhaps you could even say sort of waning enthusiasm for the overall energy transition. Perhaps, as Christoph says, everyone's realizing that it's a lot more complicated than we thought a few years ago. But look, it doesn't really matter how difficult it is, right? This is not a problem that we can turn our backs on. We can't throw our hands up in the air and say this is too difficult. You know, this is something which we collectively, as the world business community, need to address. The world is on course for For a temperature rise of 2.5 to 2.9 degrees, we need to address it. We need to get our arms around it. We need to make a difference.
Right, but the gap there is between the need to address it and the mechanism to address it and the actual execution of addressing it. If it ends up being so complex and so difficult and the financing becomes so great, the need may remain, but the result may not be reached.
Well, let's, to go back to the point I was making just then. If we consider, if we don't talk about SAF, if we talk about this is one leg of the energy transition. It's the liquid fuels leg of the energy transition. It's not the only one, right? We have wind, we have solar, we have nuclear, we have hydro. The level of investment that has already gone into wind and solar, this is a fact which is also in the 2024 roadmap, over the last 20 years is, I think it's $5.2 trillion, right? So yes, $4 to $8 trillion over a 25-year period is an eye-watering amount of money, but it's not unprecedented. There are other elements of the energy transition, other legs of the energy transition, which have already received the level of investment that liquid fuels is going to have to receive over the next 25 years. So it's a huge amount of money, but it's not unprecedented. It can happen with the right mix of policies on both the supply side and the demand side. And it has happened historically, and it can happen again. There's no reason why it can't.
We need to...
Yeah, I can give a couple of examples of that, actually.
Please.
Yeah. Because if I just take my parent companies, like I said, we're 50% Macquarie Bank, 25% PGGM, the Dutch Healthcare Pension Fund, and 25% Australian Retirement Trust. If you look at Macquarie, one of the biggest asset managers in the world, $600 billion of assets under management, and you look at their green, they've been at the forefront for 2 decades of green energy transition solutions, particularly in solars and renewables. Just their $1.7 billion investment in DESRI in the States in autumn, up to $1.7 billion in autumn last year. Again, solar renewables in the main. If we look at PGGM, only this month, $2 billion in credit risk sharing for carbon renewables projects and project finance in collaboration with BNP Paribas. However, on SAF, if we look at both of those entities, if I just take them by comparison, Macquarie has invested up to 175 million in Sky Energy in the Netherlands, which is planning development of 2 SAF facilities, one in Europe and one in the US. Those are capital commitments, but to your earlier panel, that's late stage technology. It's at that level 7. It's not where I invest. It's not in that stable infrastructure bucket. It's a different type of capital.
But those investments, those investments that other parts of Macquarie are making are, in a sense, across, as Patrick was saying, the range of biofuels and for various purposes for them. You see what I'm saying? The breakout for aviation is what?
Oh no, I mean, if we take Sky Energy, they've already signed a partnership agreement with KLM. Okay,
right.
That's already there for long-term offtake agreements. If we look at PGGM's investment in Elysee Energy in France, that is for hydrogen-powered SAF. Okay, it's finding those links and those partnerships.
That's exactly it.
That's it.
That is it, because that sort of energy investment is helping the industry get towards, or completely towards financing aviation, towards net zero. But it is, in a sense, different to the leasing side, in a sense, in terms of the purchase of the most fuel efficient or the next generation of aircraft. But it's all part of this same ecosystem, which is what we're getting to, in a sense. And I think that's a very strong example, because it does show you can't split. It's a bigger picture, and everybody has to play a part of that jigsaw within it, which is what Peter Elbers was saying yesterday about the necessity for, we talk about your airline, it's not just SAF that's going to help get there.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, I'm sure every airline has its own path to 2050, its own roadmap. Many airlines, including ourselves, also have a 10% SAF target for 2030. So we have the interim target for 2030. We have the net zero roadmap for 2050. I'm sure every airline is slightly different depending on the market they're operating in. As Peter said yesterday, it's going to be a mix of different strategies. I mean, if you look at Cathay Pacific's own roadmap to 2050, I mean, roughly speaking, I mean, these are not very specific numbers, but roughly speaking, to give you the big picture, in terms of our own efficiency improvements, so things like fleet renewal, elimination of ground emissions, ATC improvements, all of these things which drive that 2% per year efficiency improvement that Christoph was referring to earlier, that will drive about somewhere between 20 to 25% of our net zero savings. This is against the 2019 baseline. I think most airlines use 2019 as a baseline. So let's call that 20%. It should be slightly bigger than that, but that's about 20%. SAF is going to have to be about 50%.
So that's 70?
Yeah. Might be slightly smaller than that. I think based on where we are, what we're looking at the moment, probably 50% would be the upper range. So it could be 45 to 50%. So you are going to be left with this 35%, which in the jargon of the SBTi is called residual emissions, right? So what does that mean? Well, it can mean offsets, or it can mean investments in carbon capture, various ways of, basically contributing to the decarbonization of the environment outside SAF and outside the efficiency improvements of the fuels that we use. And to my knowledge, I think every airline roadmap will have an element of residual emissions. If you're in a market where you probably have higher mandates, your residual emissions might be lower. For us, we're looking, as I say, at about maybe 30%.
How efficient is the offset and or the ETS schemes in dealing with the residual emissions? Because that is indeed, the mechanisms are supposed to force towards.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm the wrong person to ask about ETS, Richard, because that's obviously intra-European flights, which doesn't apply to Cathay Pacific in the main. But of course, we have actually a very well-designed global offset framework called CORSIA, which was referred to in the previous panel. And I mean, it as a framework, of course, it's not perfect, but CORSIA as a framework should work. I mean, it is, it's designed in such a way which creates a level playing field for airlines. Now, how is it working at the moment? Well, terribly. But the reason it's not working at the moment is that countries are not making the eligible units available for CORSIA purchase. It was, I think, referenced in the conference yesterday or the day before. I think the only country in the world so far which is making eligible units available is Guyana, based on reforestation programs. I mean, it's complicated because countries also have their commitments under Paris. They have their nationally determined contributions. They have a choice to make. Credits that they generate can go to their own NDCs, or they can divert some of those to CORSIA and other global programs which they can sell. But I think in terms of the design of CORSIA, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's a reasonable design. How is it working at the moment? It's not, because the eligible units are not being made available, and that has to be, a huge effort on the part of the global community, and will be driven, I think, in part by IATA as well.
On this question of the responsibility or the role that you see as the lessor of the company. Now, you buy the aircraft.
That's right.
You buy the most fuel efficient aircraft with the most fuel efficient engines, which will allow your customers to obviously gain the benefits. What do you see as your responsibility thereafter?
Well, I think you have to take the step back and say, in the first place, we're investing in the most fuel-efficient technology. Okay, so we are investing, in the case of Macquarie AirFinance, we're investing in the most fuel-efficient technology aircraft. And that is our core objective, to get a risk and reward on the residual value and the cash flow from our airlines lease rentals. So that is our core. That is what we do. And we are actually facilitating the energy transition by investing in those aircraft types. We have a portfolio of over 6 billion, and over half of our aircraft by book value will be at that level by next year. But to answer your question, you're saying, what's our responsibility thereafter?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the investment in the new aircraft that are the most fuel efficient is also somewhat, they are the aircraft that are available, in a sense. The aircraft that are being manufactured at the moment tend to be the most fuel efficient, and they will be the ones that the airlines want. But I'm wondering, outside of that scope, now you talked about the other, you talked about the, and we'll come back to discussing the rest of the group, because what they're investing, but just as the lessor, what do you think?
Okay, I mean, so we've spoken about the capital. We have to look after our Scope 1 emissions. No more than when I was visiting Air India there the other day, they're in a platinum LEED building, which means that they have very low emissions, and that was very pleasing to see. I mean, all of that begins at home, looking after your Scope 1, looking after your Scope 2, looking after what your actual, albeit small, it may be small, but it is important to get the small things right, your carbon footprint right, look at offsetting business travel emissions. These are the things that lessors have to do. The one thing we're doing in Ireland obviously is a huge centre of aircraft leasing. We have Aircraft Leasing Ireland, which is the consortium where everybody comes together. And we actually sit on the sustainability panel there as well. So we try to have commonality in our approach as well. And for example, they've come out with training across the pillars of ESG, which all of our staff have undertaken. So it's also about that education and understanding, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, understanding how it applies to the industries. But what we can do is build the partnerships with our parent entities that are investing in SAF. And I know that's where you want me to get to, Richard.
Yes, it is, because that's where the balance sheet comes in. That's where leveraging the balance sheet and the bigger investments comes into it, doesn't it? Because that's when you start to get the joined up bit of large-scale finance that provides the finance for the refineries, or the new feedstock provision. All of those sort of things comes because when people like yourselves provide the finance to make it happen.
Yeah, but they're different pockets of capital, remember?
Yes.
Yeah, so, I have my capital, which is long-term stable. It's taken us 40 years to get our heads around residual values of assets. So, that's what we do. Yeah. But it's finding access to those other pockets of capital and encouraging those partnerships and collaborations.
I do wonder, when we talk about this, it always ends up as what role of government? Patrick, I see you sit back at that point. What role of government? And this difference of incentivized versus subsidy versus carrot and stick, which is core to the whole question of how we do finance this over the medium and longer period, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I think the reality is that this is enormously complex. Right? I mean, the energy transition, moving from a fossil fuel-based economy to a net zero economy is just enormously, enormously complex. And, in our area, it requires a level of global coordination between policymakers, i.e. governments, the fuel supply chains, the people who are investing in the new facilities that will be, producing the new types of fuels, in addition to investment in new innovation. So, the future types of SAFs, the e-fuels, the power-to-liquid solutions, which are also going to come online in the next 10 to 20 years, and of course the airlines, right? So, you know, the level of policy coordination and global coordination which is required to make all of this work is enormously complex, and it's not happening at the moment. It's disjointed. You have a patchwork quilt of different solutions.
But do you think it's going backwards? And obviously this brings us to the issue of lower fossil fuel prices, but also an administration in Washington that has shifted the agenda, therefore making it less. When you've got so many energy companies, I won't say reneging on their promises, but at least shifting away from their promises.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I would. I mean, I think it's certainly not moving forward, right? I mean,
yeah.
I think that you know, I hate to get into finger pointing during these conversations because, you know, I honestly believe that it is just such an enormously complex ecosystem. You know, I think from whichever perspective you look at it, from the policymaker or the fuel company or the airline, you know, it is enormously challenging. What's required is a level of global coordination that we don't have today. What airlines require is a level playing field, and what the fuel companies require is supportive policies which stimulate the sort of investment that we're talking about. What you have in the world today is a patchwork quilt of different solutions which are in very different places. In the EU is all stick and no carrot, so they have the mandate today at 2% going to 6% by 2030. Yep. You know, you have to comply, or you're paying effectively. You know, effectively you're paying a tax on that. You know, on that mix of fuel. You know, the U.S. Still until now, especially in places like California, where they have the use of the renewable energy certificates, has been all carrot and no stick. So there has been a reasonable level of investment into SAF infrastructure in California, but because there's no mandate or no levy of any kind, you know, it's completely voluntary, right? The uplift in California. So, I mean, a reasonable policy mix has to have an element of carrot, an element of stick, and there needs to be a level of global coordination so that it creates a level playing field for the participants like us.
What I'm suggesting is that because of that complexity, the mind-bogglingly level of complexity requiring that cooperation, when something simplistic comes along, and I'm talking now about the current policies coming out of the US, which is much more of a drill, baby, drill. As soon as you've got something that people can go away to, instead of all this massively complex stuff, then it never gets done. And what happens is it gets overturned, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. The US is driving an argument that is shifting us in a different direction, and the complexity, I'm suggesting, the complexity of what's required mitigates against it.
Well, I would say governments go, governments come, you know, administrations change, policies change. We're talking about a, you know, generational, multi-generational energy transition, you know, over multiple decades. And, you know, so I don't think tying too much of this to, you know, one specific administration and their policy is you know, is particularly meaningful.
Except I'm surprised at how quickly things have gone in the opposite direction.
Well, I think Christoph was right on the earlier panel in a couple of ways. One, in saying that there is a waning enthusiasm, perhaps, you know, a greater skepticism. But as I said in my introductory comment to this panel, I mean, we really have to keep our eyes on the problem. The science hasn't changed, and it won't. You know, the world is on course for the type of temperature rise, which would cost us exponentially more than any of the trillions of dollars numbers that we talked about in the energy transition. This is something that we cannot fail at. I mean, you know, businesses, governments, policymakers have to solve this problem, no matter how complicated.
As I was reading about your CV, and just a career steeped in finance of the aviation industry, of different types and leasing and things. Do you believe that the money, and not just, I'm not talking about the leasing industry per se, okay. I'm talking about the industry because you have an extremely wide view of it. Do you believe that the industry has the capacity to provide its necessary funding and finance for this?
For what exactly?
To play its full role in this transition.
I think, if you were saying you looked at my CV, I mean, at the end of the day, we all do transactions for risk and reward, okay? So it comes back down, I'm an originator, I do deals, the deals have to make sense, and it's back to the, what is the risk that I'm taking on? And then will the equity finance come? Will the debt finance come? Well, if they understand the risk, yes, it will come. And it's very complex in terms of the ecosystem that we're talking about, but there's always capital and finance there for certain types of risk, be it TRL 7, TRL 6. I mean, that is obviously not, I'm much more on the infrastructure end of it, so much more stable capital risk. So I believe it will come, the financing will be there, but it is a transitioning to the earlier panel. It is a transition. That doesn't mean you abandon one sector and just go all into another. It's a process. It's
but
a transition.
What does the financing require? You talk about the element that I'm not talking about the risk per se and whether it works or not. I'm talking about the geopolitical side of it. What do people want to see before they're prepared to stump up the necessary cash?
Well, geopolitical risk. I mean, it's like when I'm looking at a lessee, an aircraft lessee in the jurisdiction that they're in, and whether that's the jurisdiction that you can repossess an aircraft from. And I think India introducing fully applying the Cape Town Convention is going to facilitate that. I mean, ourselves, like Indigo, we're going to be 20 years old next year, and the fact is that getting the right political framework in place, like Cape Town in India, is fundamental to making sure things work. So you always have to have that balance of regulation and political risk to make sure that you can invest the way you want. Yeah.
It requires supportive policy framework on the supply side, along the lines of what we've seen in California over the last decade, where it becomes cost effective for people to invest in that supply chain because the stimulation is there. And without that level of policy support, the investments won't be made. And then on the demand side, you require a level playing field so that all of the ultimate customers, the airlines, are uplifting similar levels of SAF at approximately the same time. You don't need complete global coordination in every country of the world, but you need a level of, approximate policy coordination across the world so that people are moving at roughly the same speed.
On both sides of that equation, how far are we off it?
Well, on the supply side, we're a long way off it. I mean, there really are just very, very small pockets around the globe where where policy has been supportive enough to steer significant amount of money into the end of the supply chain, and that is the primary reason why I believe there's still quite a significant gap between where we are today as an industry and the 10% that a lot of airlines, including ourselves, have set as a target for 2030. And on the demand side, it's a complete patchwork, right? I mean, you have your 2-3% levy in Singapore, you have your 2% to 6% in the EU, your 2% to 10% in the UK, 0 in the USA, with no, with no obvious change in sight, especially with the current administration. So it's a complete patchwork, and that creates a totally unlevel playing field, which makes it almost impossible for airlines to
You get the last word, Lynn. You get the last word.
We're all part of the value chain, Richard. Like, we are all part of this value chain. I mean, in my area of expertise, we're investing in the most fuel-efficient aircraft. We're working with Air India. We're working with Indigo. But I do believe through our parent companies that we can facilitate collaboration. We are in the process of developing through PGGM, through my 25% owner, a hydrogen-powered SAF facility. That's late-stage development. So we can facilitate those partnerships, but the value chain, you've got to stick to the knitting and know what your risk and reward is. And I'll leave it with that, because that's how you do deals, Richard.
Do a deal. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.